One of the more intriguing and radical statements of Chazal relevant to Purim, which is brought in basically every sefer, every person trying to explain secrets of Purim, every person trying to get into the depths of the meaning of it, will quote this Mamar Chazal, beginning the Arizal, the Shlach Kodesh, the Chassidish Sforim, the Litvish Sforim. Everyone is going to be talking about this. And as usual, there's a large amount of ways in which these sayings, these statements can be conceptualized. And as usual, what most people know, and what we generally know, is only some kind of vertlech, some kind of mishmash of things that can be put into this or taken out of it. Very few people have a certain organized clarity of what's going on, where does this come from, where is it going to, not only in a scholarly, dry way, but also in understanding the life of it, how statements have a life and they have an entire context, and when you find out what they actually mean and what they were taking to mean in different ways, in different contexts, and why they've got to say this in most basic, al pi pshat, al pi soid, al pi remez, al pi omek, you start grasping what's actually going on, and you start also touching very serious sugyas, very serious questions. We start to see how these kind of statements are not some kind of poetry that doesn't obligate anything, doesn't mean anything, isn't really serious. It's actually very serious, and of course, in order to understand this, in order to get to this, you need to take apart. There's a very long process, a lot of work. If you want to understand Chazal, you have to have a systematic understanding of how the Medrash works, how Medrash Chazal works, how different kinds of Medrash Chazal work, and how different kinds of different thinkers and different philosophies and different systems of thought work, and try to make sense of all of this. This is really our work in all of our classes, in these classes, to try to clarify it, and not to clarify it in a killing way. We're not trying to ruin things by saying, well, it's only some sort of historical thing. We're trying to clarify the broadness of directions, of streams of thought that go through in all of these things, and start to see that when you start doing this, you start to gain clarity over what's going on, and start to gain the ability of taking ownership and the ability to actually do what we need to do with all of this. Hopefully in this series of classes I'll be able to take apart the history and different contexts and different interpretations of this statement and start getting a clearer understanding of it. We're going to take it a piece at a time and give a certain structure, give a certain order to it, and this way we'll be able to open ourselves all the gates, all the different ways of taking this, and all of the greater subjects, all the greater areas of thought, all the greater disciplines that this is really touching, or this is really miramis to, this is really signifying. And the statement is, you might have guessed from the title, a very statement that then the language in which it's most known is the language of the Kali. We'll get to this in this installment a little clearer. In Hamoadim yu Beteilim, Purim Lowy neftulim. In other words, in the time, maybe Lowy, maybe Mashiach comes, whenever that is, another question that should be asked, that all holidays, or maybe all ksuvim, would be butel, Purim will stay. This is the statement that the language that gets quoted in most Chassidish Sforim is the language of the Piyut. Im kol Hamoadim yu Beteilim, Yemei Purim Lowy yu neftulim. And it's brought down. Now let me give a slight overview, a very quick overview of different ways in which this kind of statement is taken, and then we'll be able to start giving our order and try to take it apart in a more systematic way, in a more clear way, and to build it up in a clear way. In general, whenever we read Sforim, Sifrei Drush, Sifrei Machshava, Sifrei Ein, on the holidays, we sort of see them all as answering one basic question, or as doing one basic thing, which is praising and telling the greatness of the current event, or the current date, or the current mitzvah, or the current time. Of course, there's some really cliche ways of doing this, some really kitschy ways, and like more modern books, you could see it literally like every day. This is the greatest day, and they're giving it all its praises, and it seems like even the author himself doesn't really believe this in any level. He doesn't think it's corresponding to anything. It's just like something that you have to say when you give a speech or you say a Dvar Torah about the Shabbos or the Yom Tov. If they say, well, Purim is such a great Yom Tov, okay. But this, of course, has some seriousness to it also. It doesn't mean that this is just a dumb way of doing things. There's a serious way of doing it, and obviously it's a very proper thing. Every time we discuss a certain mitzvah or it's the time of a certain mitzvah, it's a certain holiday, we're working on a certain subject, and we're going to want to praise it. We're going to want to bring out the specific values in which it represents, which might be different, or in which way is this represent something, which way does this symbolize something, which way does this bring us to something that's more than what we would have in the whole year, that's better. And of course, everyone would understand that these things are not meant to be absolute. They're not actually trying to create a hierarchy of holidays or create a hierarchy of Pesach. If you ever read, for example, and we can get into the detail and see if this is exactly correct, but if you read the Piyutim, which, like we started to say, this statement is known mostly in the language of the Piyut, and Piyut is generally a compilation of Midrashim on each Yom Tov, and it's always doing this. Like on Pesach it talks about how great Pesach is, and on Shavuos it talks about how great Shavuos is, and on Sukkot it talks about how great Shavuos is, and this is what should be done. It's a very normal thing to do, and it's a very correct thing to do, and it's a very proper thing to do. But when we see it this way, we don't really get any information out of it. What we get is praise, what we get is excitement, what we get is hitorerut, what we get is taking it seriously, getting into the mood of this specific thing that we need to be doing today. And one of the ways of doing it is by bringing out the specific praises of it, the specific values of it that it's different than everything and more than everything. But this is not a systematic thing, and it's also not to be taken as a hierarchy. That doesn't need to be a hierarchy, and this is generally true, at least in this level. This is one level of reading things, and it's a correct thing to do. It doesn't mean that it's not something they should do, but it's one level of things. And then in this context, someone might read, and the Rambam can be read as doing this. There's another big source we'll get to for this kind of idea. And every halacha, the Rambam, many halachas, finishes off with some praise for this mitzvah, and then the Hilchas Shabbos will tell you how great Hilchas Shabbos is, and then the Hilchas Yom Tov will tell you how great Hilchas Yom Tov is, and so on. Not exactly, but things like this. And this is a very proper thing, since writing a book of halacha is never only just the dry law, never only the dry halachas. The Rambam definitely sees his sefer as trying to get to more than that. For example, besides for wanting to tell you what to do on Shabbos, he wants to get to do Shabbos. He wants to convince you that it's a good thing to keep Shabbos. He wants to convince you to connect to this in some way. So he's going to give some praise and going to give some meaning. He's going to give some explanation of how Shabbos is great. And same thing for everything. So if he's talking about Purim, we'll talk about why Purim is great and how Purim is great. And he's talking about Hanukkah, I'll talk about how Hanukkah is great, and so on. And these things are not meant to contradict. When we say Hanukkah is the greatest, and Purim is the greatest, and Sukkot is the greatest, they're just, in each time, bringing out what's needed in a Musar way in order to inspire you to take this specific mitzvah seriously, to take this specific holiday seriously, and so on. And at least it's important to note that at least some statements that actually don't have more meaning than this. At least some statements were to begin with meant to be inspirational, they were meant to be educational. And if you want to make a system out of it, you're doing it the wrong way, and you're being very confused and very, don't know the correct word, but reading things in a way more literal fashion than they were ever meant to be read. And some people make this mistake. Of course, there are different people, different different books that do try to systemize things, that do try to make systems out of everything, and then they try to ask, okay, how can you say that Gedolei Purim, is it Gedolei Purim, or is it Gedolei Hanukkah, or is it Gedolei Sukkot? Okay, and they try to give some account of it. If you have an account, that's true, then that's good by itself. That's something important to notice. Of course, that if, for example, the Arizal and people in his school would always be very precise, they would want to have a hierarchy. That for them, there's no such a thing as saying something, well, this is great, but really something else is just as great. If you say something great, you have to mean something. It has to mean a specific madrega and some olim and so on. And then if you say Purim is the greatest, then he has to explain how Shabbos is great and what the exact Arizal has entire pages of getting through this. But I think the important thing to notice is that the Arizal, I don't think, started off by saying, well, every statement of the Medrash needs to be literally true, and then we need to build a hierarchy out of this. He really starts out by having a system in his head, by having an understanding that there are different ways of things being holy, there are different ways of things being great. And then he fits it into the system, and of course, by his intuition or his Recha Kodesh or his understanding of how Shabbos is and how Purim is and how Pesach is and so on. Each thing is based on entire understandings of each thing in itself, but it's not based on, I don't think we're meant to read it by, it's based on having this sort of silly way of over-literal reading of things, that nothing can be, if I can't say on Pesach that Pesach is the greatest and Purim is the greatest, and them not be a contradiction, because I'm not trying to make an informative statement, I'm just trying to make an inspirational statement. I don't think that's correct. There's more points to be spoken about this point of making everything the greatest and having things in a hierarchy or taking things literally, but that's not our subject today, so I'm going to be moving on from this. Now, of course, if you assume, and I think it's true, this assumption would be true, and I think that if you read this statement in its original context, you'll see that it's not actually trying to do this. It might be some implication of it. It might be used in some sources, in some spaces in this way, but I don't think it is actually meant to be used in this way. I think that if you look up the sources, you'll see that it's saying something more serious, or at least touching more serious subjects. So to repeat what I was saying, to clarify somewhat in other words, although the default reading, probably I would call this the number 0 reading of any Mamar Chazal, of any Medrash, we're not talking about halacha here or about statements which are of systematic theology, of any Medrash, the default reading, especially in the and both the default reading and the context in which we generally find or meet this statement that says that although all Hamoadim, all holidays can be butal, can be stopped happening at some point, and also Lowy, or whenever that exactly will mean, as we can think. But Purim will not be stopped, or the same thing for Megillas Esther. We'll differentiate all these things in great detail coming up. Although the default reading of this and the context in which we find it usually is the context of praising the current holiday. In other words, we should take it as some sort of musar or torerut or praise, and not as a precise statement of fact. And what I propose and what I've seen from researching this and looking it up and finding is that this is not entirely correct. And there are definitely very serious meanings and very serious contexts, very serious understandings of this statement, and connected to entirely huge subjects and huge sugyas of Torah, of theology, of thought in general, which we'll have to try to disambiguate and disentangle now. So what I want to do as the first step is to give a slight overview of the different directions in which this statement can be taken and has been taken, and I will try to show each one of them, the sources of it and the reasons why we should understand it in this way, and the greater, more broader understanding of the subject itself. And then we'll get into going in a certain order, going through the different contexts, different sources, and different ways of actually understanding this, which will be a larger project. So the first context in which we actually find this statement is actually in the context of a specific question regarding the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah, or the mitzvah of Purim in itself. And of course, this can be taken as indicating a broader subject. So everything, all the context and all the different ways of reading that we're going to list here, each of them has a specific instantiation and specific place in which it works relative to Purim or relative to Megillas Esther. And then that itself can be taken as representative of a broader question, which Megillat Esther or Purim might be one very, very clear example of it, or maybe the most clear example of it, but it's actually a broader question which pertains to the understanding of the whole Torah and the understanding of the whole entirety of thought. The first context in which we find this, and I think that it's obvious for anyone that reads the first source of this, which is in the Yerushalmi and Megillah, Perek Aleph, Halacha Hay, I think, and we'll get to this in more detail, is that the context, or at least this is a very serious question that we find in different statements around this also, relative to the Megillas Esther, that there's a big problem regarding Megillas Esther, which is also really a problem regarding, in certain sense, all mitzvot Rabbanan, or maybe especially mitzvahs that are ascribed to Nevi'im or to Nevi'im Aksivim, different things that we find only in Nevi'im Aksivim we don't find in Torah, which already shows us more meanings, but we'll think of this for the second, which is that both the Megillas Esther and Purim are taken by the Chazal, we can think of why they take this as the prime example of this and why it's a question that arises, especially on Purim. But they take this as to be as the one thing, or maybe the only thing, or maybe the most clearly, most obvious thing that was nitkan, that was created by the later authorities or by the later prophets. And we can actually argue if even anyone ever claimed Mordechai and Esther to be prophets. There's the whole discussion about this. Esther B'Recha Kodesh Nemre or not, and Anjek Nesek Doyle, or that maybe we're metakin Purim, can we even talk about it as being prophetic, or maybe it's just mitzvah derabanan, or takanas chachamim, or something like that. But it seems to be trying to take us stronger, because everyone seems to agree that mitzvahs derabanan themselves might be problematic, but it seems to be a slightly more problematic, or another level of problematic, to create a whole new holiday and a whole new, maybe even a whole new part of Tanakh, the Megillas Esther, which was incorporated as part of Kisvei HaKodesh, as part of the Tanakh. Maybe that's part of the problem. So there's two problems there, which we can disambiguate two different issues in the same issue. And if you read the Gemaras about this, you see them talking about both in one breath, but sometimes differentiating between them and sometimes connecting them. So they're part of a broader question, but both can be seen as a very specific question for them, and specifically regarding Purim. Number one, we created a new mitzvah, a new holiday, which is just a kind of mitzvah. Let's assume holiday is a kind of mitzvah. Holiday might be, again, not only just another mitzvah, maybe a holiday is something even more than a mitzvah that might somehow be more foundational or more touching the basic form of how a Jewish life looks. Maybe adding a holiday needs stronger authorization, so to speak, as just adding a mitzvah or a minhag. But in any case, adding a new mitzvah, there's 613 mitzvahs, and now there's 614, or as many as you want to count mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, but there's one more mitzvah, which is Purim. Right? They generally, Chachamim, which talk about as the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah, which they see as the primary mitzvah of Purim. Of course, we can include in this all the mitzvahs of Purim, Mishta V'Simcha, Yom Tov, Mishlech Minas. However, we understand that, which is another whole discussion. And number two, which might be even prior to this, or might be a bigger problem than this, or might be a smaller problem than this, is the addition of entirely new book into the canon. Now, canon is not a Jewish word. Canon is not a word which we find anywhere in Chazal or even in later Jewish sources. I've never found anyone use the word canon. And not only the word canon, it seems like the concept of a canon isn't entirely the way in which they frame this question. The way this question is framed over here is more of a question, and there's really two ways of framing it. But the first way, which we're speaking about now, is the question of, can we add a part to the Torah? Can we add? Now, of course, we can ask about all Nevi'im and Ksuvim, who gave them the permission to add to the Chumash, who give them permission to add to the Torah. When we say Torah, we mean Chumash. We don't mean all Chavdal Kisvei HaKodesh. And generally, I think the answer to this is taken to be prophecy. That's actually a serious question. I don't think I've actually looked up. Some people talk about this. It's not an easy question to answer, and it's not a question which the Chachamim seem to be worried about, like who decided what's in and what's out. We have, of course, famously certain questions about Shir Hashirim, about Kehelas, about Yechezkel, if they're Metames Sedaim, if they have Kedushas Kisvei HaKodesh or not, of course, also about Megillas Esther, but they don't seem to be asking the question of canon. So canon is a question of what are the correct books to read, what are the correct books that we take as authority. And that's a question, of course, in the Christian world. There were huge wars, and maybe in some sense lasting till this day, over canonization of books, of which books are the Bible and which books are not the Bible. In Chazal, we don't find this language. We find the language of discussing which books are. Two things: have to have Kedusha. Now, of course, what does it mean for a book to have Kedusha is not something that they define. So we're not sure. We only know the halachic implication of this, which is that the Kanas Chachamim, that Kisvei HaKodesh are Metames Sayidayim, and then we have a whole discussion if certain books are Metames Sayidayim, but they don't ever draw out, almost never. There might be some little slight pieces that touch this, but they almost never draw out the theological implications. In other words, does this mean that this book is authoritative in some way? Can we learn from it how to act? Can we learn from it how to think? Can we learn from it how to feel? Does it make a difference regarding to that? It's not clear that the Chachamim think of that as a significant difference. It might be that they think, in any ways, that the only thing we can really learn from is the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Chumash Torah, and everything else is just a question of how to respect this book or this physical object of a book, if it has Kedusha in it. But they're not really worried about the sanctity of the text or the sanctity of the meaning of it and so on. And they might think if it's worth reading, then we'll read it anyways. And if it's not worth reading, we're not reading it anyways. So it doesn't really it's not clear that they think of canonization in the same way as Christians think, or as later Jews would think, and maybe inspired by the way Christians think about it. It's a very serious question, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Going back to where I'm saying, so there's these two questions. The question number one is who gave the people creating Purim the guts or the power to create a new mitzvah, to create a new holiday, and who gave them the authority to add a new book to Kisvei HaKodesh, which is of course assuming a certain concept of Kisvei HaKodesh, or maybe we could even say adding a new part to the Torah. That's really the word to say. And somewhat related to this is the question of, is Esther B'rich HaKodesh Nemra? In other words, if it was B'rich HaKodesh, and even if it's B'rich HaKodesh, it's not clear that everything that's written B'rich HaKodesh should be Kisvei HaKodesh. So these might be two independent questions. It's not clear that they're the same question. And there's some talk about this in later recent people talking about this. So but that's the first context. And now just to clarify, how do I think that this is even connected with the statement of Kol HaKsivim Beteilim, Al Kol Hamoadim Beteilim? I'm pretty sure, and I'll show this in detail, I'm pretty sure that this entire statement of Kol Hamoadim Beteilim is actually trying to answer this question of who gave the authority to add Purim into the Bible, or who gave permission to add Purim into the list of holidays. And as we'll see, it seems like this statement is actually a machlokes in the Rishalmi, because Rabbi Yochanan actually said that everything will be butl, including Megillas Esther. It was only Resh Lakish that said Megillas Esther will not be butl. It seems like Rabbi Yochanan is going on the side, which there's opinion in Tanoim and Amiroim that didn't take Megillas Esther as seriously, and they said that maybe it's only at Takanas Chachomim, maybe all Takanas Chachomim by definition will be butl. Maybe when he says Kol HaKsivim, he means maybe even Ksivim, but he means in the sense that they're not the Torah, and only the Torah will stay forever, but everything else doesn't have real authority, so it will be butl at some point. When that point is, I'm not sure, but maybe that's what he means to say. At least I think that this is connected to that context, and from reading the Yerushalmi, which is the source, it's obvious that this is the discussion that they're having, and this is the context in which this statement is brought in the Yerushalmi, so it must be, in some sense at least, connected to this. So these are the first two meanings, the first two, I call them contexts, the first two ways in which this saying is read, and it seems to be explicitly in this context that it was said the first time. And of course, these are using Purim as a certain example for a certain very important yisoid, for a very important general principle of Torah. And of course, we can ask this specific question of Purim is and based on how we understand it in the whole Torah. How do we understand the authority of the Torah relative to the authority of Nevi'im, relative to the authority of Chachamim, and how do we understand the textual authority or the textual canonization or the textual sanctity of the Torah relative to other books, which might be the same question, it might not be the same question as we just saw. But these are the particular instantiations of this question, which actually lead us to a much greater question, and of course can lead us even broader into the whole question of what do we mean by prophecy, what do we mean by mitzvahs, what do we mean by holy texts, what do we mean by kisvei HaKodesh. That gets us into a more general philosophical question of thought in general. What do I mean by saying certain things are fixed or forever, certain things are not forever? What do we even mean by that? What is the difference between these two things? What does it mean to have certain words or certain sources or certain mitzvahs, certain laws that are obligatory, some things that everyone has to do, that there's obligation, there's an chovah on them, and some things are not chovah, maybe just a minhag or just some lesser level of chovah. So these lead us into all of these questions. A third way in which this is read, and which leads us into a second group, we could call it. First group was the question of the authority of the sages or the authority of the Nevi'im relative to the authority of the Torah. Some sort of a family of questions of that. Now we could talk about a third question, which leads us into a broader question, which all of these things are related, but leads us into a third way of reading this, maybe a fourth and a fifth way, which we can talk about two things, but let's talk about them in particular specific terms and then in general terms like we've done before. So in particular terms, and these two things literally match onto different Gersois, different. There's a Yerushalmi seems to be talking more in the first family of things. Then there's a Medrash Mishle, which is quoted, which seems to be talking more in the second family of things, or at least seems to connect to a family of statements in Medrash and in later interpretations that seem to be taken in this way. And it's the question of the status of Me'adim which were created, were there to celebrate certain historical events. Let's say it like this. What happens to them when those events are superseded by greater events? This is a question that we know as a general question, but let's speak about it. Here it's actually discussed as a general question, right? Because it seems to say that all Me'adim, all holidays can be butl, but Purim cannot be butl, or will not, at least in some level, at some stage, there will be a loss or a devaluation or a demotion of other Me'adim, and a promotion or a Purim not losing its status, staying in the same status as it was. Now this has to be thought in the context of understanding the concept of Me'adim in general. Like I started to say, and there's, of course, everyone remembers the more general discussions about this, about Yetzias Mitzrayim, and generally we could talk about Kol Me'adim. Of course, the different Me'adim, the Me'adim of the Torah, Me'adim De'iraisa, celebrate different aspects of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Pesach is one aspect, Shvis is another aspect, Sukkot is another aspect, but in a certain sense, all the Me'adim of the Torah belong to this time of history, which is generally called the Dor Yetzias Mitzrayim, right? There's not really any Me'adim, interestingly, and this is something that should be thought about. We have a lot of periods in history, but the formative period, and the one in which, the only one from which we have, seems to be real obligations, what we call the Raisa, right? Torah's Moshe's Torah, is the period of Yetzias Mitzrayim and Matan Torah, basically the first generation. Until after that, there's no Torahs. Even though, for example, Yeshua Benin's Kibbutz Oretz, which must be for the Jewish nation, must be at least up there along with Yetzias Mitzrayim, maybe building the Beis Hamikdash, things like this, or at least if you would make a list of the greatest events in Jewish history to celebrate, like if I would give you a list and say which of these events should we commemorate in a day in the year, I'm pretty sure that at least in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, what happens afterwards is another question, but at least in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, people would definitely say the day that Yeshua Benin crossed the Yarden, which was Yud Nisan, by the way, the day which Moshe HaMelech built the Beis Hamikdash, which was on Sukkot, or around Yom Kippur and Sukkot, so complicated, or something like this. Maybe the day of the victory of some great battle that some king had. These are things that generally get commemorated in histories, and since Me'adim, at least one of the understandings of the Me'adim, which is in the Torah, is the historical commemoration of events. Of course, there's the other one, which is the agricultural seasons, so maybe that's another thing to think about here, but can't talk about everything at once. But at least in that sense, and this seems to be the simple pshat that we mostly focus on this. We say on Pesach Zechel Yetzias Mitzrayim, Sukkot Zechel Yetzias Mitzrayim, and so on. On these things, number one, they seem to not, by definition, right, cannot be relevant forever in the same way, right? Yetzias Mitzrayim, as much as we'll try to elevate it, and we have a whole series of shirim to try to elevate Yetzias Mitzrayim from the particular historical story and explain it in more general theological terms, all kinds of levels. In the end of the day, and in Mikra Yetzim the Pshat stays the Pshat, and the basic meaning and the basic way in which Pesach works is by the logic of being a Zechel Yetzias Mitzrayim. Now, we can easily imagine, like probably already happened, that a generation should be so far from Yetzias Mitzrayim that this should be totally irrelevant, or even more than that, like the Gemara in Brachos talks about, and there's psukim about this. Yirmiyah Novi talked about it, and the Gemara tried to explain it. What happens when there is an even greater event that supersedes this, right? What happens if there's Mashiach, or maybe these, if we could talk about Bayis Shani or Bayis Rishon. These are sort of the same questions, just in different historical contexts. What happens when there's an even greater miracle that it seems to be silly to be talking about Yetzias Mitzrayim when you have a miracle in front of your eyes, or a certain historical event right in front of your eyes that happened last week or last year or last generation that seems to be much more important to commemorate. So this is, of course, a very particular way of framing the question, but it's very possible that when this medrash, we find Mefarshim going in this way, and this is at least a very important context or an important way to think about what happens when Purim. The Gemara says that Purim is a Kal from Pesach. If Mama Avdas Lecheres Amram Shirim, Mavas Lechaim Lekolshkan, there's another Kal in the Megillas Tanis to explain why Purim is a greater miracle than Pesach, because Pesach was only for Zechurim and Lava and Huma and Bikashlak and Esakal. So it seems to be obvious that Purim should be more greater Yom Tov than Pesach. And maybe even at some point when Kol Me'adim Beteilim, Pesach wouldn't be bottled, or Purim should not be bottled, at least should have some sort of level of simcha, or some sort of level of commemoration that's stronger than Pesach. And maybe this is little simple pshat of that medrash. We'll discuss this in detail to show the reasons why to think that this is a simple pshat, but it's at least a very totally different way of thinking about it, right? Earlier we talked about the whole question of who give the chachamim or the people of later generations the power to create new holidays or new parts of the Torah. And here we're talking about an entirely different question, which is what actually happens. Of course, these things are obviously related, because if you think in a certain way about what happens when certain historical events are less relevant, then you might have to think a certain way about the power given to the chachamim of those generations to create new frameworks or create new mitzvahs of how to celebrate the Torah and so on. These things are connected, but they're very different issues. There's totally different questions. So of course, we can talk about this. Of course, we can talk about, and maybe in another particular sense, this is a particular sense, right? Of at least the people of the generation of Purim, or in the generations immediately after it, would obviously be more excited, so to speak, or would be more relevant to them to talk about the Ness of Purim than the Ness of Pesach. In the same way, we could talk about it in another way, which is, and sort of continuing the same discussion, but part of this family of discussions. We have obviously the discussion on this other mefashim that's want to explain that this is talking about this entire discussion of Me'adim Megillas Tanis, which was the entire list of Yom and Tovim that were created in Bayis Shani for different historical events. Actually, Purim is one of them. Interestingly enough, it's one of them. The Gemara already asks why, if it's in the Pusik, why does it have to be Megillas Tanis? But it's one of those. It's one of those Me'adim, and maybe it's talking about that list, that all of this Me'adim as they were. There's a machlokes in the Gemara also about this, but at least we assume, we pass in this shitta that Megillas Tanis is not relevant anymore, and why? Also, mostly for historical reasons. There might be deeper reasons also, but firstly for historical reasons, that all these great events that were important to people of a certain generation stop being important, and if it would be important, maybe it should be new things important, and we're not capable of taking care of those new things and commemorating them. We're too confused, or too much gulas, or too much problems, or whatever the Gamliel exactly meant when he said in any case, this is another event. So in other words, we could talk. This is really a discussion is sort of ignoring the question of things that are in Torah and Rabbanan. I think that this has implications for that discussion, but we can ignore this, and we could say this Shat of Me'adim is commemorating events, and the events have, by nature, fade out of historical memory in some way, and other things take them over. And this is the natural series of events. Now, of course, you're going to ask me if you're interested in the dogmatic halacha of it. How could it be? This is a Derais and this is a Rabbanan. How could that be? So that's a question that belongs to the first family of questions. The second family of questions belong to another new question, which is Me'adim, which commemorate historical things. What happens to them after those things go out of style? After those things are superseded by more important or more closer or more better, greater historical events, maybe even greater miracles, and so on. And this is a serious question which is discussed in different Amar Chazal, and so on. And of course, we could talk about the flip side of this question. So you already have in this family two different questions, two different parts, right? In the second family, which is the family of Me'adim, historical Me'adim, being superseded in some way. There's one way of talking about that, just like even Pesach can get superseded by Mashiach or by some greater things happening later. We talk about Me'adim Midrabanan, Megillas Tanis, which were actually superseded, and maybe Megillas Esther should have been in part of that family and for some reason did stay, like we learn in Masechta Rosh Hashanah about Megillas Tanis. And thirdly, and this is the Rashba's understanding of this medrash, and we'll get to it in detail for other things, we could think about the opposite, right? We could think about different Me'adim, different historical commemorations, which got superseded not by something better than them, but by something worse than them, right? We can be in Gulas, and we can be in a state, and maybe this is another understanding of why Megillas Tanis was stopped, according to the shittas that it was stopped, which we go with that shittas, because we're not existing in all these most of Megillas Tanis, whereas people of Bayis Shani and Malchus Chashmonoi having victories over the Yevonim or things like that, and we've lost all of that, so it doesn't really make sense for us to celebrate things that we already lost, or and here we're struggling under some new emperor, some new king, which is giving us problems every day, and this doesn't really make sense. It'd be very silly, it'd be very pathetic to be talking about some earlier victory that some Jewish king had 500 years ago. And it's possible that this is talking about this, and like the Rashba tries to explain, that in some periods, in some historical periods, it seems to make no sense to celebrate Pesach. It seems to make no sense to celebrate other holidays. Well, the Rashba doesn't literally say this. This is something that we could think, since he opened the door to think in this way. Maybe Purim is special, maybe just because it's talking about us staying alive, and as long as it's still alive, you can talk about that. So maybe that's the meaning, or some other meanings which we'll find how Purim could have a staying power even in a space where it's not superseded by something better, but superseded by something worse. Right? We don't have the physical space or the mental space or the emotional space or the conceptual space to understand any other holidays which were created to commemorate historical good things, but we can still do Purim in some sense. Okay, so that's second family of context, or second family of understandings of where to even think, and which sigya do we even look, and which masechta of Olam Machshava do we even look to think about this. And of course, the second family, just like we've seen in the first family, just like there's a particular question, what do we do about Purim? This also leads us into a much broader general question of how to read history. Are we actually pushed forward by history? Does our world change? Does our thinking world change because we're in a different period of history and different things are important to us, or maybe we don't? Maybe the whole idea of being religious or of belonging to what some people call a community of memory, right? To belong to Judaism, the Quran, the whole idea of Zuchar, to maybe Shabbat Zuchar, right? Maybe the whole idea is to sort of try to stop history. Maybe that's the opposite. This is a very broad question which can be asked in the Jewish context and can be asked in the general context, and it leads us into an entirely very broad question of how to read, how to live. A third family of discussions, which of course all these things might be just different words for the same thing. First I spoke in a theological sense, now I'm speaking in a historical sense, now I'll speak in a eschatological sense. But it's a third family of discussion, and it connects to and all of these things have sources. All these things have different Mamari Chazal, different Rishonim, different Achronim that are talking about this, whether in this particular context of this Yimei Purim Lowy Neftulim, or whether in general. And the third family is going to be focused more on this point of saying, of this Medrash, or this Mamar Chazal saying, in Lasad Lowy, it doesn't actually say when. It doesn't say Lasad Lowy. Maybe in some Gesas it says Lasad, different when exactly this time that it's talking about is. But in some end time, or in some phase of history, or in some phase of the world, or some phase of development, personal, national, moral development, that will exist. So first we could talk about Nevi'im and Ksivim being Butul, whatever Butul means. Ceasing to exist, ceasing to be taken seriously, ceasing to be read, ceasing to be canonized, ceasing to be obligatory. Or we could talk about Ol Adam as ceasing to be obligatory, ceasing to be celebrated, ceasing to exist. Whatever exactly this cessation is, this will happen in some point. And this, obviously, we can talk about it in a very particular context. Is it true? Or in what way might it be true that in some point in the future, we could talk about like in the end times, right? At some point at the end, we will stop reading Sefer Yeshaya. We could think about different reasons why this might be true. Maybe we'll stop reading Mishnah. Maybe we'll stop reading a lot of Takunas Chachamim. We'll stop doing a lot of Takunas Chachamim that were created, or maybe even some mitzvahs, or maybe all mitzvahs. And this Ma'amar Chazal is, according to this Shitta, it's Machlokes and the Rishalmi, according to Resh Lakish, it's taking Purim out of that question, saying that Purim we will continue to do. Of course, we have this specific question of why Purim would be interesting and why it'd be different. But in this family of discussions, of this family of context, probably the more the part that's focused on more is the more general question, and it seems like this is it gets focused on a lot more, which is the way it gets framed usually is in the Gemaric way, which is, since the Rambam told us, made an ikir of the Torah not changing, is kind of we talk about the Torah changing. Of course, this entire framing is very late because the entire dogma of there being like a dogma of Zayz Torah the same language of the Siddur, and the Rambam is slightly different language, is a very new framing. The Rambam more or less made it up. Of course, there's such framing in the Gemara. It's similar, but not exactly the same. This is really what we're talking about in the first family of contexts, which is called in the Gemara Ela mitzvahs, that a Novi can't add mitzvahs, but it doesn't. That's not the same thing of Novi not being able to change mitzvahs, or not the same thing as things not being able to change in the future. Those are two different discussions. And of course, there's a very famous Gemara Masechtas Nida that talks about this very explicitly, or at least seems to be talking about this very explicitly until some people are not comfortable with it and try to explain it away. But it seems to be talking about the question of mitzvahs beteilis Lasad Lowy, so the same language beteilis. And it seems the Pshat Gemara seems to literally be talking about Tchias HaMeisim, when the dead will be resurrected, whenever that will be. That's the end time, or at least the Mishnah seems that's the Mishnah's version of the end time generally. And the question is, if the people that will resurrect, then will they have to wear kosher tzitzis, right? Or they'll be allowed to have tcheles? Will they be allowed to have shatnez? That's really the question the Gemara is talking about. And the Gemara seems to say that if we assume the mitzvah is Beteilim is Lowy, then there's no problem for a dead person to wear non-kosher clothes, right? To wear shatnez, because when he's gonna, even if he resurrects, he's not gonna be the avodah of wearing shatnez. On the other hand, if it's not Beteilim, then we have to bury people with kosher clothes, which is clothes that are not shatnez, because mitzvah is Beteilim is Lowy. And it seems like machlokes tanoim, machlokes amirim. And anyway, in any case, this seems to be a live question for Chazal. Of course, maybe the Rishonim paskin this question. I don't know. That seems to be a live question, and it seems, and there's very famously some other statements in Chazal, about Torah Chadashim Matitaitze, about not being have to shech things anymore. There's a very famous statement which doesn't really have a source, but Chazir, or that will be able to eat Chazir. So again, this is talking about food, non-kosher food becoming permissible. Talking about non-kosher clothes, not really kosher, I'm just calling it kosher, but clothes, shatnez that we're not allowed to wear in this world might be allowed to be wear in another world, in next world, or in Tchias HaMaisim, which is called Olam Haba, so generally. Or in any case, maybe, and this is definitely how it was taken by many interpreters, and there might be good reasons I think that this is the context. Maybe this discussion of Kala Ksivmi Beteilim, Kala Me'admi Beteilim, maybe it's really talking about what happens Lowy, what happens when Mashiach comes, what happens, and whenever unspecified end times, when the Torah stops being relevant or Torah stops being obligatory, we stop having to do the Torah, and therefore, of course, we stop reading mitzvahs, and then we start discussing details. Does that mean every mitzvah? Does that mean only certain parts of mitzvahs? Does that mean different reasons? And we can think of different reasons why certain things should be relevant, certain things should not be relevant. And for some reason, whoever said this statement, or Shlukish, said that Megillas will not be bottle. Maybe that's what he meant, or maybe he just meant to say the opposite. Maybe he just meant to say even the Megillas Esther will not be bottle. So these are at least giving a new context, giving a third way of thinking about this, specifically regarding Megillas Esther. Will it continue to be read? Will it continue to be a mitzvah of Purim in the unspecified Lowy end times? And leads us into a very general question of mitzvahs Beteilim Lowy, which leads us into the question of this ikr that the Rambam made. It's the Rambam's 9th ikr, that the Torah will not change. His 8th ikr, and leads us also into a more general thought. And of course, this one of the main reasons why people were so worried about this in the Middle Ages was because of Christianity, and to a lesser degree Islam, which claimed to supersede the Torah. So literally the word supersession that I've been using, but maybe some of them in the Sefer Ekrim has a long discussion about this, and he seems to concede that it's possible. But anyways, the lead led us into think which the big Christian claim, the big Pauline claim, is that the mitzvahs, or the ritual mitzvahs at least, stop being relevant, or maybe they've already stopped because Mashiach already came, according to them. So maybe it's already listed Lowy. But of course, the question of if Mashiach came already or didn't, or when he will come, or what it means listed Lowy, is somewhat a secondary question to this. Of course, if you interpret it to mean in some different world where there's no bodies, then maybe it's easy to say. But as long as it's some way relevant, and of course, since the Gemara is discussing it, it must in some way be relevant, right? Because nobody's really having a question if an neshama without a guf has to be do mitzvahs, right? If listed Lowy in the Gemara means when you're dead, like some of the Shainim tried to say, or if it means in some other world when nothing will be the same, then I think it's a meaningless statement. It's obvious that and that if there's a mitzvah for the body and the chazis don't exist, or what we call chazis, then it seems to be irrelevant. If the Medrash says that we'll be able to shecht a behemoth in a non-kosher way, then it's talking about a behemoth. You can maybe it's in some way different, but it has to at least have some continuity with this world. And of course, the entire idea of Tchias HaMaisim, which is the simple Chazalian understanding of the end times, is that it has some continuity. Of course, it's different in very important ways, because the dead resurrect. But there has to be continuity, because the whole idea is to give punishment, to give the final reward and punishment, to give the final din v'cheshbon on everything, and to have the final answer to all the problems of this world to happen then. So obviously, you can't just say that this is a world with no continuity, with no relation to this world. And the moment it has continuity, then the question of does the Torah apply there, or which parts of the Torah, which parts of the mitzvahs apply there, become a very serious question, and we can't be just hand waved away. Oh, it's a different world. Who cares? And therefore, this is the third context, or the third family of contexts, in which the discussion of mitzvahs Purim and Megillas Esther surviving to that context is a very live question, and it leads us into a much broader question of what happens to the Torah in this blessed love. And of course, this is also a very general question of what does it mean for the world, or history, or personal development, or national development, any kind of development, anyone that has a theory of development, that has a theory of humans, or whether personal humans, whether in greater context, whether greater social structures have some sort of end to them, and both in time and both in the sense of having a goal, of having a place to get to. What happens with all the ways in which they've gotten to it? If morality, or if Torah, or if education is trying to get you somewhere, where's that somewhere that's trying to get to you for? And what happens when you get there? Does it mean that you drop things that you've accumulated along the way because you've gotten there already? Is it just a super part of the way? These are very serious questions. I'm saying in a very abstract sense. I'm just trying to sort of generalize this question. That it's not only a very specific dogmatic question, because the dogmatic question is not really interesting, because at least as long as you're not trying to deal with a Christian theory, which is that we are already in the end times, which seems to be contradicted by looking out your window. So that's not such a big problem, at least for us. This is the answer. But at least, so therefore, the question of what to believe will happen in the future seems to be less interesting. But the question of what future means, or what the end means, and how that end looks, and what it is the relation of the end to the means, or to the ways that we're getting there. In other words, what is the relation of the goal of the Torah, or the tachlis of the Torah, to the ways in which we're getting? In other words, what's the matur of the connection, relation of Olam Haba, Tchias HaMais, and two mitzvahs, is a very serious question, and has huge implications to understanding of things here and now. Of course, if you want, there's many ways to take this to all what's known as antinomian thoughts, and so on. And we'll get to this. And this, I'll maybe make it into a fourth family of contexts, but of course, sort of grows out of this. And this is a whole discussion, very serious discussion. And I'll give you the fourth family in a more significant way. Let me frame it like this. In a certain sense, what we've done here is going through this discussion of mitzvahs and explaining that it's really related to all three or four main areas of theology. Right? Very famously, the Sefer Ikrim, Rav Chizdo Kreskas, before him, said that all Jewish theology, but maybe all theology in general, boils down to three questions, which is God, Torah, in other words, what to do, Torah, mitzvahs, and schar v'einish, which sort of includes what will happen in the end, what's the goal of the Torah. That's really how he frames it, so that's the correct framing. Right? So now we've discussed mostly the second one, or the first family of context, which is who has the authority over the Torah and who can add for it. Is it a closed system? Is it a living system? Is it an open system? Which ways is it open and which ways is it closed? And the second part, also in a significant way, maybe the second part can be connected to history, but sort of in the framing we gave, these are all questions of Torah, right? Questions of the middle part of this Ikram the Torah, which is, what does it mean, Torah, and so on. Now, and the third family of context which we just gave is really related to schar v'einish, to his third part, in other words, to the goal, to eschatology, to what is the end of everything. So we've sort of shown how this little Mamre Chazal, this little statement, which gets bounded around in Purim parties, just as material for some nice pshetlach, is really touching all the real areas of human interest and all the real areas of theology, which is just a way of saying the most serious areas of human concern. Now we skipped one, or we missed one, which is the most important one, and this is the one I'm going to finish on and try to explain in a second how at least we can get it to touch it. And the one is the first one and really the most important one. The only thing that can properly be called theology, right? Everything else is just an outgrowth of it. And that's the existence of God, or the knowledge of God, or the meaning of God, or the power of God. Now, of course, in truth, And this is where it comes in here. In truth, this is the only question. Like literally, theology is the knowledge or the study or the logos of God, right? Of Theos. And this is a question which you could go through your entire life reading Jewish thought and sort of skip it because it seems to be less popular nowadays in certain ways. Because all these questions of dogma, of can mitzvahs be, are mitzvahs eternal? What kind of authority do the sages have? What kind of understanding do we have of history and historical change and so on? All these questions are really only an outgrowth of the question of what is God and what is our relationship to God? What is the relationship of the universe to God? What is the relationship of what we call Avodat Hashem, the work that humans do in the world to God? And the most clear way of talking about this is asking the question, because when we say Torah is the second pillar of theology, right? There's God, Torah, and Yemasa Mashiach or Schar V'Einish. So the second pillar when we say Torah, and the same thing when we say the third, but we'll get to it. The real question about it, just like the language that he said, is the question of Torah min Hashemayim. And Shemayim, of course, is just a kinna, just a word that means Torah from God, right? Or a Torah from God or of God by God. Now, what in the world it might mean for the Torah to be by God or from God means that there's no way to say, there's no real way to have a Jewish theology or any kind of religious theology. That any theology that has a Torah, right? If you don't have a Torah, then you don't have this problem. But any kind of Torah theology, which can focus only on the dogma, that someone will say, well, this is what it says in the book, without answering the question of how does this touch God, or what does it mean for God, or what does it mean for God to have a Torah? What does it actually mean? What kind of God can have a Torah? And you can't run away from these questions. And the people that have touched closest these questions, and really, 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 this is where things are really interesting and where things are really dangerous and where things are really exciting. And as long as you don't see God as an area of interest in itself, as you don't have the knowledge of God, the existence of God, the love of God, the fear of God, Dvaikus and God, all of these different words, as long as that is not really a pillar in itself, and the only pillar really, right? Tzaddik, there's only one pillar really. Then everything you're going to be saying about the other things, some say, how could you say this? It says in the Torah. Or how could you say this? What about Schar V'Einish? These are all questions that are secondary or tertiary or much further down the road after you figured out what God is and what is relationship to the world and what is relationship to us and what is relationship to the Torah and what is relationship to Schar V'Einish and so on. And therefore, the real question for Purim or for Hanukkah or for anything else is, what's God got to do with this? And of course, we could have some sort of very God by proxy situation, right? This is what most people usually answer. God gave some power to the Torah or to the Chachamim, and then they told us to make Purim. So you've got God by proxy. God by proxy is not, I don't know what it is. It's not what we're interested in. It's not theology proper, right? In other words, we also have to believe you that this proxy is true. And in order to believe that the proxy is true, you have to go back to the knowledge of God itself. So you don't really gain anything by adding a proxy in between. And really, the only people that have clearly touched this question are the Mekabalim. And after them, the Chassidim. And of course, there's bad and good ways and different off-track ways of doing this and so on. But at least they touched this question. Of course, the Rambam touched this question, but not in an explicit enough way for people to get what he's doing. And you basically have to answer the question of what relation the Torah has to God. And in a certain sense, whatever answer you're going to give, as long as God has some real existence in the system of thought, that's not only as the one who gave the Torah, because that's all some people know of God. He's the one who gave the Torah. But that's definitely not enough. As long as God is going to have any independence for himself in this system, he's going to have a certain sense in which he cancels the Torah. There's no way out of this. I don't know of a way out of this. On the other hand, you're also going to, if you have a Torah system, you're going to have a way in which God is also the Torah. in which the Torah is God. Not only the Torah is from God, so it's God by praxis, but a way in which the Torah is God, or at least a way to God. Not God by praxis, and now there's no God, there's only Torah. Which is the Litvish way of thinking. And the Mekabolim explicitly discussed this. Now, again, we'll get to every single thing I'm saying here. I'll try to get a whole class just in detail to show it, and so you can believe me that I'm not just making everything up. But they very clearly discuss statements like mitzvahs beteilim, like Hamoadim Beteilim, and even in the local, particular context of Purim, and explain exactly what it means in this way of understanding that all mitzvahs, if their power, if their point is that they're from God, then they must collapse into God at some point. Now, whether we say L'asad Lova over here is a space, state, in time, or it's a state in mind, or it's just a metaphysical, ontological state, these are separate questions to be discussed. And of course, if you're a Mekibel, or if you're thinking on a theological level, then you really have to take time and space out of consideration. Although there could be times and spaces in which these levels of existence are more clear, or are more revealed, or more relevant, that's possible, but the more interesting part is not that. Or the more real part is not that. And therefore, all questions that we discussed earlier are really questions of to what extent can and did or will or have mitzvahs collapsed into God. This, you could say, dissolved into God. And to what extent are they vessels for God, or are they ways to God? And for the Mekabalim, which discussed this question very explicitly in this way, and of course the Chassidim after them, and slightly taking it to their own directions, but also actually for this point, the Chassidim, at least the original Chassidim, are pretty clearly say the same words that the Mekabalim, and I'll show you quotes for all of this, say that the Torah, the language that they use is the Torah is a certain garment for God, or a certain vessel for God. These are similar concepts. And God can be enclosed, so to speak, in the Torah. And by virtue of being a cloth for God, a levush for God, that's the reason for the whole power. That is what is interesting about Torah. And which also means that in a certain sense, the point isn't to stay touching God's clothing. The third point is, of course, it's not entirely possible, so let's get into another question. But the point is to actually get to God himself, or at least to a layer, one layer less, which is what we call Seder Torah, and so on, or Tamei Torah. So this is really the fourth concept, and it might represent a certain solution by people that think in this way. And of course, when you think in this way, you do solve all the problems, but only if you really live in thinking this way. Not only if you think and make it into a new dogma, then you get stuck in the old problems of dogma. But if this is a way that you could actually think, then you could at least see, and people say this explicitly, that if you think like this, then you can sort of solve, or at least find a way. You have a new light with which to enlighten all the earlier discussions and all the earlier problems. Now, just to close off with this, so this is the fourth family of discussions that we'll have here, and the fourth family of context that we'll have here, which is the context of to what extent is the Torah as it is today, or as it is in this world, or as it is in this level of understanding, the cloth of God, the way in which God expresses his will or his existence or his way to us in the way which we are. And to what extent does that have to change by virtue of the world changing, by virtue of our understanding changing? By what extent does actually our understanding changing, human understanding, human enlightenment, human attaining higher levels of understanding or lower levels of understanding change how they actually read the Torah? Of course, that's a very important thing to remember also. But we can't really talk about the Torah as some sort of objective thing existing in thought space somewhere. It's always going to be read by people, and according to what kind of people they are, that's how they're going to read the Torah. There's no way out of this, right? And this is very much recognized by the Mekbulim when they talk about these kind of things. And to what extent does L'asad Lova, which means maybe the level or the time or the space in which the Torah is fulfilled, or the Torah is unraveled from its garments, sort of seen through all of the windows, all of the mirrors, and all of the tinted glass windows in which the Torah shines through. And to what extent does seeing that light negate the window? To what extent doesn't it? And are there some parts which we can call Purim that don't ever get collapsed into God? So these are the real discussions. This is where the entire discussion turns into a real discussion of theology. And of course, I don't have a broader way of saying this. theology probably is the most broadest way to say it. We might be able to translate it into existential terms and so on, or generally metaphysical terms, which theology might be above or below that in the great category of everything. So that's another whole discussion. So anyways, just to summarize what we did in this class, we've begun to discuss the famous statement of Hamoadim Beteilim, Purim, Lowy, and we gave a certain map, a roadmap of 4 or 5 different families of ways of reading this, different worlds in which this is read. The first family, or the first non-family, is just to read it as a sort of praise for the Yom Tov, or sort of a artist, or sort of mitzvah, or sort of poetry, which is really irrelevant, and talked about that. Second, which I call the first family, because the previous one was just the zero family, is the question of who gave the Chachamim, or whoever it was that created Megillas Esther and created Purim, the power and the authority to add on to the Torah, and how does this work? Does this mean that it has less power or more power? It's the second family of questions. Third family, or the second family, starting from as one, second family of questions is what happens with historically commemorative holidays like Pesach, which is Me'adam Deraisa, or like Me'adam Megillas Tanis or Chanukah and Purim, which Me'adam Derabanan, when they're superseded by either something greater than them or something worse than them, or just being far away. What happens when that happens, and how do we understand that? And of course, this leads us into the third family of questions, which is the question of Netzches HaTorah, the question of mitzvahs b'teles listed Lowy, which is itself one question: to what extent are the mitzvahs and the me'adim and the kisvei hakodesh themselves fixed? To what extent can they be added to? Which is sort of goes back to the first question, but here we're talking about this more explicitly. And to what extent might they be? There's a second part of this. To what extent might they be nullified or fulfilled or abrogated or changed in some way when we get to the place in which the entire Torah is trying to lead us, which is in Mashiach, however you want to call it? Does that mean that we have to continue being Mekayim all the mitzvahs or not? And there's Purim Yotzim and Aklal to this, and so on. The fourth family is where we get to think about actual theology, which is to what extent is this all about God? To what extent is just a garment of God? Is this a garment hiding God? Is this a garment revealing God? Is there a sense in which the garment collapses or dissolves into God? And are these levels of existence or levels of understanding attainable? And what happens when you attain them? And do you go back to doing mitzvahs after that? These are the more serious questions of theology and of thinking through these questions from the perspective of thinking of God Himself. That was my overview, and the next class will start very slowly to go through each specific context. And first we'll start with the earlier sources, the Yerushalmi, the Midrashim, and then the Rishonim, to show how they understood it, and each one of them is an entire world of understanding. We have to bring in the entire world of how that person or that writer or that book understands the universe, and try to get to this particular area of interest. And slowly we'll get through each one of them, and there will be a lot to talk about.